The first light of dawn drifted across Silver Creek's main street, soft as breath over the red dust. The town stirred awake. The bakery door creaked open. A horse whinnied by the hitching post, and a faint prayer rose from the small church on the hill. Then came the steady rhythm of hoofbeats, growing louder, until every head turned. Thomas Garrett had returned. He rode slow, posture straight, though his shoulders still bore the weight of long miles. 3 weeks' riding supply runs for the rail line had left a thin coat of dust on his leather jacket, but nothing could dim the quiet confidence in his stride. Women along the street paused, shading their eyes from the sun, whispering to one another. Thomas's smile, gentle, warm, carrying the calm of sunlight, had been the town's favorite subject for months. But this morning, his eyes weren't searching the crowd. They were fixed on one person. Lenora Briggs was sweeping the porch in front of her small general store. Each stroke of the broom was steady, measured. Her brown skin caught the morning light. Her black hair, pinned in a neat bun, left a few loose strands along her cheek. The pale cotton of her dress moved faintly in the breeze. She didn't seem to notice the gaze upon her, or perhaps she was pretending not to. Not until the jingle of spurs sounded close by did she finally look up. For a heartbeat, time stopped. Thomas halted beside the hitching post, hand resting lightly on the reins. The early sun traced the lines of his sunburned face and the stubble grown rough from sleepless nights. His voice, low and raspy from the road, broke the silence. "Morning, Miss Briggs." Lenora's fingers tightened on the broom handle. "Good morning, Mr. Garrett." Her tone was polite, composed, the same tone she used with every customer. Yet when their eyes met, something shifted. A brief, unsteady beat, too soft for sound, but strong enough to make the heart falter. Silver Creek bustled on. Mrs. Whitaker crossed the street with her basket of bread. Miners laughed loudly outside the saloon, and children ran circles around the well. But between Thomas and Lenora, for that small moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Thomas tipped his hat, the hint of a smile tugging at his lips. Not the easy grin the town gossiped about, but something slower, quieter, touched with shyness. "Been away long?" Lenora asked, eyes on her sweeping. 3 weeks, he said. "The road's long, the dust worse, but it feels good to be home." Home. The word carried weight. For most, Silver Creek was a promise. For Lenora, it was both shelter and boundary. Her father, once an enslaved man who earned his freedom, had opened this shop a decade ago. When he passed, she kept it running alone. The townsfolk still greeted her, but not without that flicker of unease in their eyes. Some only bought when there was nowhere else to go. Others turned away in silence. She never complained. She simply worked, quietly, steadily, like breath itself. Thomas knew. Each time he stopped by for supplies, he'd heard the murmurs behind her back. But something in her, maybe that calm defiance or the way she met the world's chill without flinching, stayed with him long after he left. Now, standing before her, he wanted to speak, if only to keep the moment alive. "You keep the cleanest porch in town," he said lightly, half teasing, half sincere. That earned him a small smile, quick, fleeting, but bright enough that the morning seemed to glow a little more. "Someone has to," she replied, her tone softening. He nodded, started to move away, then paused. "If you need a hand unloading freight from the depot later, I'm around." "I can manage," she said evenly. Then quieter, "But thank you." He touched the brim of his hat in farewell and turned, leading his horse down the street. Lenora watched him go, not sure why her hand had stopped mid-motion, the broom tilting slightly in the air. His shadow stretched long under the morning sun, solid, unhurried, sure. Across the road, Thomas slowed, glanced back once. She was still there, framed by the porch, the light pooling gently around her. And in that dust-lit street, it felt as if the whole day, maybe the whole story, began and ended in that single exchange of glances. That's how it started, with a quiet smile, and a woman brave enough to meet it. Rumors in Silver Creek didn't need newspapers or telegrams. Only a few idle tongues, a bright morning, and sometimes a smile in the wrong place. 2 days after Thomas Garrett rode back into town, a circle of women gathered inside Mrs. Henderson's dress shop began to murmur. "I saw it myself," one whispered, eyes bright with excitement. "He stopped right in front of that colored girl's store." "You mean Miss Briggs?" "Yes," and he smiled at her, even said good morning. A collective gasp followed, part surprise, part fascination, as though they'd just witnessed nature breaking its own rules. Another woman spoke firmly, her voice sharp with certainty. "Oh, he's just being polite. If Thomas Garrett ever truly paid her any attention, this town would lose its mind." That same morning, Lenora was restocking shelves inside her shop. The low hum of gossip drifted through the open window. She couldn't catch every word, but she knew the meaning. Her lips pressed together briefly, then she went on stacking flour sacks with steady hands, her face calm, almost too calm. People could say what they pleased. As long as her work was done, she would endure. The bell over the door chimed softly. Mrs. Whitaker, the banker's wife, round and perfumed, pearls gleaming at her neck, stepped in with the knowing look of a woman who believed herself informed of all things worth knowing. "Good morning, Miss Briggs," she said, her tone honeyed though her eyes carried curiosity. "I'll take some sugar, a few spools of thread, and oh, have you heard Thomas Garrett's back?" Lenora nodded, placing the items on the counter. "I saw him pass by the other morning." Mrs. Whitaker smiled vaguely. "They say he's been friendly with you." "People must be mistaken," Lenora replied evenly, wrapping the goods with practiced hands. "He's just a regular customer." "Is that so? Well, that's good to hear. Mr. Garrett's quite the admired gentleman, you know. Plenty of young ladies would be delighted to catch his eye." Lenora lifted her gaze, steady but not unkind. "Perhaps folks ought to mind their own business, ma'am." Mrs. Whitaker froze for half a breath, then forced a tight smile. "Of course, and you're right. Still, interesting how often he visits your shop, isn't it?" She paid, gathered her parcels and left, her perfume lingering like a heavy cloud after the door shut. Lenora exhaled slowly. She was used to those glances, part pity, part curiosity, as if people were waiting for her to stumble just to give them another story to tell over supper. That afternoon, the sound of hoofbeats she'd come to recognize stopped outside. She didn't need to look to know who it was. Thomas Garrett stepped through the doorway, the light softening the rough sunburn along his jaw. "Afternoon, Miss Briggs," he greeted, tipping his hat. "I'll take some coffee, little salt. And if you've still got it, that honey you sold me last time." She nodded, turning toward the shelf, hiding the faint smile that threatened to appear. "You went through it that fast?" Thomas chuckled. "Not exactly. I dropped it. Horse kicked the crate." It sounded plausible enough, but his eyes told a different story. Maybe he just wanted a reason to come back. She reached for the last jar, brushed off the thin layer of dust, and wrapped it carefully in brown paper. As she tied the string, he laid his coins on the counter. Their fingers brushed, barely, but the touch was like a spark through still air. Both of them froze. In the silence that followed, even the ticking clock seemed too loud. Lenora withdrew her hand first, eyes downcast. Her voice was low but steady. "Anything else you need, Mr. Garrett?" "No," he said. Then after a pause added softly, "That'll do, thank you." He took the parcel and walked to the door. Lenora busied herself rearranging the counter, trying to still the quick rhythm in her chest. Outside, the sun was tilting west. He made it halfway down the street before stopping. When she looked up, he was standing at the doorway again, glancing back with a small, quiet smile, the kind that barely showed, like a thread of gold across his weathered face. "Miss Briggs," he said, voice low, meant for her alone. "Yes? I'll be back for more honey." The door closed behind him. The small bell above it rang for a long time after, carrying the last shimmer of that afternoon, a moment soft enough to set all of Silver Creek whispering for days. Rumors in Silver Creek never died. They only changed their shape. And this week, the name on everyone's lips was Thomas Garrett. Early that morning, Sheriff Collins stopped by the small cafe where Thomas sat alone, a steaming cup of coffee in front of him. The sheriff set his hat on the table, his eyes heavy with concern. "You know," Collins began, voice low and rough, "folks in town are talking about you and Miss Briggs." Thomas looked up, his gaze steady. "There's nothing to talk about, Sheriff. I just bought a few things." "Sure," Collins sighed. "But in Silver Creek, sometimes one smile's all it takes to give people a whole story to tell." He leaned back, studying the younger man. "I'm saying this as someone who's known you a long time. Don't give them a reason." Thomas didn't answer. He just nodded slightly, his fingers tightening around the cup. Collins waited a moment, then spoke again, slower this time. "You came here to start over. Don't let your past crawl back out just because of a woman." Thomas's jaw tensed. "My past has nothing to do with her." "Not with her," the sheriff said quietly. "With the ones who'll dig it up. You know how this town is." When Collins left, Thomas stayed seated. Outside, the early sun cut through the cafe window, laying a band of light across his roughened hands. He'd thought Silver Creek would be quiet enough to let him forget the accusations, the suspicion, the humiliation of being branded a thief. 3 years ago, he'd worked for one of the biggest cattle outfits in Colorado. The owner was rich and crooked, keeping 2 sets of books. When the money went missing, they needed someone to blame. Thomas took the fall. He hadn't fought back, just rode away in silence. In the West, gossip traveled faster than bullets, and he knew there was no winning against words. So he came here, to start over, to work hard, to keep his head down. But ever since Lenora Briggs had stepped into his path, that fragile peace began to shake. That afternoon, he rode past her shop. The wooden sign reading Briggs Mercantile hung crooked, ready to fall with the next gust of wind. She was struggling with a ladder, trying to hammer the nails deeper into the frame. Thomas reined in his horse and dismounted. "Careful, Miss Briggs," he said, voice calm but firm enough to make her start. "I can handle it," she said, sweat beading on her brow. "Maybe," he replied, "but if you fall, this town will have another story to chew on." "Let me." She hesitated, eyes narrowing slightly, then stepped aside. He climbed the ladder, steady and sure, hammer in hand. She stayed below, bracing the ladder's legs, watching. The sunlight angled across the porch, glinting on the dust clinging to his shoulders. When he drove the last nail in, a small puff of red dust drifted down, catching in her hair. Without thinking, Thomas reached out to brush it away. Lenora froze, breath catching. His fingertips barely grazed her hair, a fleeting touch, nothing more. Yet the silence that followed felt deep as a canyon. "Thank you," she murmured, voice barely more than air. He nodded, his gaze lingering. "Don't mention it. I just don't like seeing something about to fall and doing nothing." It sounded casual, but his eyes told another story. Her heart beat faster. She turned away, pretending to tidy the bags of flour by the door. Thomas stood there a moment longer, as if reluctant to leave. He slid the hammer into his belt, then said quietly, "If you need help fixing anything else, I'm around." "Silver Creek's small," she said lightly, though something softer stirred beneath her words. "I'm sure I'll see you soon." He smiled, a slow, almost private smile, tipped his hat, and walked off. Lenora watched his figure fade down the dusty street. The broom in her hands grew cold, but a strange warmth bloomed in her chest. The place on her hair where his hand had brushed still seemed to hold the heat of his touch. That night, as lamplight flickered across her small room, Lenora sat by the window, looking out at the sleeping town. She thought of her father, his thin frame, his gentle eyes, and the words he'd left her. "Never let them teach you to be small, Lenora. The Lord gave you hands to build, not to beg." Those hands trembled now, not from fear, but from something new, something she hadn't felt in years. For the first time, she felt seen, not for her color, not for her solitude, but for herself. Outside, the night wind brushed against the new signboard, making it creak softly. It sounded like a whisper, the beginning of something fragile and true. That Sunday, the church in Silver Creek was fuller than usual. Morning light poured through the stained glass, coloring the faces of solemn worshippers. Bonnets bowed, hands folded tight in prayer. Reverend Coleman stepped onto the wooden pulpit, his voice carrying firm and low through the still air. "The Lord made order in this world," he said, eyes sweeping across the rows. "And those who break that order invite chaos. A wise woman must guard her virtue and keep herself from associations that bring shame." He spoke no name, yet everyone knew who he meant. A few whispers rippled through the pews. A few glances slid toward the back, where Lenora Briggs sat quietly, her plain blue dress folded neatly around her knees, her hands clasping a worn Bible whose leather edges had long since faded. After the service, as people spilled into the sunlight, Mrs. Whitaker approached with Josephine Edwards, the mayor's daughter, the so-called Rose of Silver Creek. They stopped in front of Lenora, smiles polite, their eyes anything but. "Miss Briggs," Josephine said sweetly, her voice like sugar mixed with vinegar. "I hear your store's doing quite well lately, perhaps thanks to special customers?" Lenora said nothing. Mrs. Whitaker added smoothly, "Indeed, it's rare to see a woman work so hard. But you understand, I hope, that a gentleman like Mr. Garrett must protect his reputation." The words were soft, but they landed like a stone. Lenora simply smiled, nodded once, and walked past them, her skirt brushing the dirt as she went, leaving the two women staring after her, dissatisfied by her silence. 2 days later, her shop was unusually busy. Near midday, a tall man with a red, drink-flushed face walked in. He gathered a few bags of flour and beans, then deliberately dropped his sack on the floor. The shelves rattled, and a white cloud of flour rose into the air. Lenora froze. "Sir, what are you doing?" The man sneered. "Just slipped, Miss Briggs. Or are you going to say I did it on purpose? Because you're colored." The air went still. 2 customers slipped quietly out the door. Lenora's voice stayed calm, even. "I don't care about anyone's color, sir. But if you can't respect my store, I'll have to ask you to leave." "Feisty one, ain't you?" he mocked, stepping closer, his broad hand flattening against the counter. "Think your friend Garrett's gonna protect you?" Before Lenora could answer, the door behind him opened. Thomas Garrett stood in the doorway, reins still in hand, eyes cold as cut glass. He walked forward slowly, each step deliberate. "Something wrong here?" The drunk turned, forcing a smile. "No trouble, friend. Just talking." Thomas's voice stayed level, but there was steel under it. "Miss Briggs already said enough. This isn't a place for drunks." Silence filled the room. The man's smirk faltered. He backed away, muttering, "You'll regret meddling in this, Garrett." Then he shoved the door open and stormed out into the street. Thomas didn't watch him go. He bent down, gathered the fallen goods, brushed off the flour, and put everything back where it belonged. His movements were slow, unhurried, calm enough to shake Lenora more than anger would have. When he straightened, he said simply, "All fixed." "You didn't have to," Lenora murmured. "Didn't have to," he agreed. "Just don't like seeing someone treated unfairly." By sunset, the whole town had heard. Everyone knew Thomas had taken the side of the colored woman. The next day, his freight contract with the warehouse was canceled. At the saloon, men he'd once called friends turned away. When he passed down the street, conversations stopped. That evening, Lenora carried a small basket of bread to the boarding house where he lived. When he opened the door, surprise flickered across his face. "I heard," she hesitated, "people haven't been kind to you because of yesterday." Thomas leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "It's fine. I'm used to being misunderstood." "Still," she said softly, "thank you." He looked at her, eyes deep and still, like a lake after wind. "You don't owe me anything, Miss Briggs." His voice was quiet but firm, the kind that left no room for argument. She stood there a moment longer, then nodded. "I know." She turned and started down the darkening street. Before she stepped inside her home, she glanced back. Thomas was still on the porch, his tall frame outlined by the golden lamp behind him, a lone figure in a town that had quietly turned its back. Lenora watched him for a long time. In that moment, she realized she had never seen anyone look so alone, and never wanted so much for someone not to be. After the incident at the store, no one spoke of it again, but Lenora knew. In Silver Creek, silence was never peace. It was only gossip catching its breath. Still, she no longer felt the same fear. Perhaps because now, whenever she thought of Thomas, there was a different kind of quiet inside her. Gentle, steady, like a place to rest she'd never known before. On Thursday afternoon, the wind carried the scent of rain from the far mountains. Lenora glanced up at the shed roof behind her shop. The warped boards bowed inward, leaking in slow drops. She told herself she'd fix it, as she always did. But her hand, halfway to the hammer, stopped midair. A reckless thought flickered through. Later that day, when Thomas passed by with his horse, she called softly, "Mr. Garrett?" He turned, that familiar calm in his eyes. "Yes, Miss Briggs." "Do you have a moment? The shed roof's leaking, and I don't think I can climb it alone." A faint smile tugged at his lips. I take it that's your polite way of saying I'm taller than you. She lifted an eyebrow. Just saying I don't want the roof to collapse, that's all. Moments later, he was on the ladder with a hammer in hand, and she stood below, steadying the frame. The afternoon sun glinted off the damp sweat across his back. She listened to the rhythm of his hammer, the hum of the wind, and felt her heart stumble over its own beat, caught between nearness and distance. "Pass me the left board," he said. She reached up at the same moment his hand came down. Their fingers brushed, brief, accidental, but enough to make both pause. He took the board. Their eyes met through a slant of light. Then they both looked away, as if another heartbeat would give something away. By the time the sun sank behind the rooftops, the first drops began to fall. Western rain came sudden, like a sigh from heaven. Thomas jumped down just as the sky opened, catching her wrist and pulling her inside the shed. Rain hammered the tin roof, a wordless song above them. They stood there, breathless and soaked. Lenora tried to hide her smile, but failed. Thomas leaned an arm on the wooden shelf, pretending to inspect the roof, though his gaze drifted back to her. "Are you cold?" he asked, his voice lower than usual. "No, I'm used to it," she said, though her hands trembled slightly. He said nothing more, just shrugged off his coat and draped it gently over her shoulders. The scent of leather and rain mingled, warm, close, making her breath catch. "You don't have to..." "Keep it," he interrupted softly. "I can manage. You can't." A long silence followed. The rain filled it, steady and soft, blurring the edges of light. In that half-dark, time seemed to stop. Then Thomas spoke again, his tone slow, distant, like a man tracing a memory. "I grew up in Tennessee. Old wooden house, roof leaked worse than this one. My father worked cattle for a big rancher. My mother washed clothes for others. I left home at 16, thinking there'd be something better past the ridge." He smiled faintly, though his eyes drifted. "There was, just not the kind I expected." Lenora looked up at him. "I understand." He tilted his head. "Do you?" "My father used to dream of a land where people stood equal, where a man's skin didn't decide his worth. He never found it. But I think I'm still trying to keep that dream alive for him." They looked at each other for a long moment. No more polite smiles, no more guarded distance. Only truth, bare and trembling, shared between two people who'd spent years hiding their loneliness. Thomas smiled faintly, almost a whisper. "If he could see you now, I think he'd be proud." Lenora lowered her head, pressing her lips together to hold back something rising in her chest. He stepped closer and brushed a drop from her cheek, not sure if it was rain or a tear. Their eyes met, slow, deep, wordless. In that suspended moment, the long solitude within her began to melt, warmth spreading from where his hand had touched. When the rain finally stopped, Thomas said quietly, "I'll come back tomorrow. Make sure the roof's holding." Lenora nodded. "All right." But that night, lying in bed, she couldn't sleep. The image of him, the faint light on his hair, the rain sliding down his jaw, his hand on her shoulder, played over and over. She was afraid of what her heart already knew, because sometimes what the heart knows before the mind understands is the one thing we can never turn back from. The storm rolled in by late afternoon, black clouds swallowing the valley of Silver Creek. Wind screamed across the porches, slamming shutters and carrying the scent of wet earth and cold air. Townsfolk hurried to bar their doors, draw their curtains, and brace for 3 days of rain and wind. Lenora was bringing the last flour sacks inside when Thomas appeared at the door, soaked to the bone. "The road up the ridge is flooded," he said, his voice raised over the thunder. "Can't make it back to the boarding house." "You can stay here," she said without thinking. "There's an old cot in the storage room. It's not much, but it's dry." He hesitated, out of manners more than doubt, then nodded. "Thank you." The little store felt warmer once they lit the oil lamp. The flickering gold light danced on the walls, softening the hard lines of the room, and of them. Outside, the rain battered the roof, the wind howled down the street, but inside something gentler settled in the quiet between them. Lenora found a little rice, some beans, and a handful of dried greens. Thomas helped her build the fire. They sat across from each other as the wood cracked and hissed, smoke curling into the smell of rain. "Can you cook?" she asked, her tone teasing. Thomas smiled, leaning over the pot. "I used to cook at the cattle camp. No one ever complained. They were too hungry to." She laughed, soft and sudden, and the sound filled the small room like a candle being lit. For a moment, they both forgot the town, the whispers, the walls that had kept them apart. There was only rain, breath, and the narrowing space between two hearts that had grown tired of being careful. After supper, Thomas fed another log into the stove. Firelight danced across Lenora's face, turning her brown skin to liquid amber. She stared into the flames and spoke quietly. "I used to think I could live with loneliness, that if I just worked hard enough, stayed decent enough, the sadness would never touch me." He said nothing. She went on, her voice nearly lost in the wind. "But sometimes I get scared. Scared that no one will ever really see me. Not the color of my skin, not this shop, but me." Thomas was silent a long while, then said simply, "I understand." She looked up, startled. "I know what it's like to be seen and never truly known," he said. "I've been the stranger everywhere I went, always someone people kept at a distance. And after a while you start to believe that's all you'll ever be." A flash of lightning lit his face, the weary lines, the quiet ache she'd only guessed at before. In that brief light, she saw the depth of it, the same kind of hurt she'd carried for years. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but not the places I went, the ones I never stayed long enough to call home." The words sank into her chest like a slow, steady pulse. She didn't reply. The room filled with the steady hiss of rain. A drop of water fell from the ceiling, tracing a line down her cheek. Thomas reached out instinctively, wiping it away. His hand lingered, warm, trembling, against her skin. She didn't pull back. Her gaze lifted to meet his, steady and unafraid. The fire wavered, light flickering over their faces. The world outside roared with wind and thunder, but inside all sound seemed to fall away. Thomas leaned in slowly, as if crossing a distance years in the making. It wasn't desire that drew them together, but the deep recognition of two souls finally finding somewhere to belong. The curtain stirred with a gust of wind. Their hands found each other, not rushed, not uncertain, just inevitable. The oil lamp trembled, its flame bending low, then steadying again like a breath released. Outside, the storm raged on. By dawn, the valley was washed clean. Mist lay over the fields, silver and soft. Birds called from the wet branches, their voices small in the hush after rain. Thomas rose early, rekindling the fire. Lenora sat at the table, hair loose, her face calm, unreadable but not cold. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their eyes met, long enough to hold everything that words could ruin. And when morning light spilled through the window, both of them knew. Something had changed, quietly, but forever. The morning after the storm, Silver Creek shone with strange clarity. Rainwater still pooled in the dirt road, mist drifted across the main street, and every rooftop sparkled as though the town had been washed clean. Yet inside Lenora, no sunlight could chase away the quiet ache, that tender, fearful heaviness that felt like a wound still warm with touch. Thomas had left before dawn fully broke. He'd paused at her doorway, hair still damp, his voice rough with sleeplessness. "Thank you for letting me stay," he said, with that small, weary smile that made her heart tighten. "Be careful. The roads are still slick," she replied. Nothing more, because if she spoke again, her voice would tremble. When the door shut and the sound of hooves faded down the wet street, Lenora stood motionless. Her hand drifted to the spot on the table where his had rested, where his warmth still lingered, fragile as an unspoken promise. By noon, the gossip had bloomed. Josephine Edwards, who happened to pass by just as Thomas left, wasted no time retelling the scene with false pity. "I didn't want to believe it," she whispered to a group of eager ears, "but I saw it myself. Garrett leaving her shop before sunrise, and she looked, well, like she hadn't slept at all." The story spread through Silver Creek like fire through dry grass. From the cafe to the church steps, from the tailor's shop to the bank, the whispers flared and tangled. They spent the night together. She trapped him. No, he ruined her. Lenora heard every word. Each whisper sliced through the fragile peace she and Thomas had built, brief, precious, and already gone. That afternoon, Mrs. Whitaker appeared, buying nothing but a spool of thread, and leaving behind a fresh dose of poison. "Such a shame," she sighed, voice dipped in honey but sharpened at the edge. "People trusted you, Miss Briggs. Perhaps it would be wise to close the shop for a while. Let the talk die down." Lenora only nodded. "Thank you for your concern." She didn't defend herself, didn't argue, because in a town like Silver Creek, truth held no weight against the hunger of a ready mouth. Thomas heard the rumors from Sheriff Collins. The older man found him by the stables, his tone heavy. "People are talking, Thomas. Even the church ladies. If you stay, she's the one who'll pay for it." Thomas tightened his grip on the reins. "I didn't do anything wrong." "I know," Collins said softly. "But in a place like this, being right doesn't always save you." The words stayed with him all afternoon. When dusk fell, he went to her shop. He stood at the door, hand half raised to knock, then stopped. Through the window, he saw the faint flicker of her oil lamp. He knew that if he stepped inside, he would never leave again. Inside, Lenora sat at the table, a cup of tea gone cold before her. The store was so still she could hear the wind slip through the cracks in the wall. No one had come all day. Familiar faces passed by the window, glanced in and walked away, pretending not to notice her at all. She did not regret it. Not one moment. That night had not been a mistake. It was the truest thing she'd ever lived. A night where no one asked where she came from, what color her skin was, or whether she was worthy of love. But she feared what it would cost her, her father's store, the life she'd built with her own hands. Rain began again, soft and scattered. She rose and moved to the window. The last orange light of evening broke through the clouds, shining faintly against the glass. It lit her face, catching the glint of her eyes that carried both pain and an unspoken strength. She placed her hand on the window frame, the same spot Thomas's hand had touched that morning. The gesture caught in her chest, sharp as breath. She remembered his voice, low and steady, the way his hand brushed her cheek, the quiet that wrapped around them like the world had forgotten to breathe. She remembered everything, as someone remembers a dream they know will never return. Outside, the church bell tolled, long, low, unhurried. Lenora closed her eyes. She knew by tomorrow Thomas might be gone, and if he left, no one could blame him. But when she opened her eyes, she didn't move. She stayed by the window, staring out at the street gilded in fading sunlight, her hand still resting where his had been, as though by holding on a little longer, she could call the warmth back. Outside, the clouds parted, letting through a faint golden glow, the light after the storm, and deep inside her heart, something small and stubborn refused to fade, a fragile faith that no matter how the world turned away, part of her would always keep reaching for him. 3 days later, Silver Creek had returned to its usual stillness, but to Lenora, every sound felt foreign. The clop of hooves, the whisper of wind through the cracks in her door, even the rhythmic hammering from the blacksmith's shop made her heart tighten. That morning, when she opened the store, she saw an envelope on the step. The paper was speckled with dried rain, the handwriting hurried but neat. Miss Briggs, I'm leaving Silver Creek this morning. Not out of regret, but because I won't have you bear the burden that belongs to me. I've lived alone most of my life, but I never knew loneliness until I realized I had to walk away from here. Believe this, even if I'm gone, my heart stays behind. T. Garrett. The letter trembled in her hands. Beneath his final line was a blurred mark. Rain or tears, she couldn't tell. She stepped out onto the porch. The morning sun was pale and thin, casting light on the empty street. Where Thomas once tied his horse, only hoofprints remained in the damp earth. Beside them lay his old saddle blanket and the worn coat he'd always thrown on when the nights turned cold. He was gone, quietly, the same way he'd come into her life. From that day on, Lenora moved through her work like someone walking through a dream. She opened the store at dawn, swept the floors, stacked the shelves. But each time her hand brushed the honey jar he used to buy, a sharp ache pulsed through her chest. Every corner of the shop carried his trace, a handprint on the doorframe, the hammer he'd left behind in the shed, the echo of his laugh when he'd spoken of sandstorms and cattle drives down south. The townspeople, too, had grown quieter when passing her shop. There were no more whispers, but no kindness either. They treated her with a polished distance, polite, careful, as if their peace depended on erasing her name from their stories. That evening, Sheriff Collins came in. He set his hat on the counter, his voice worn with fatigue. "Miss Briggs," he said, "I just came from the post office. There's news about Thomas Garrett." Lenora froze, nearly dropping the glass in her hand. "Is he all right?" The sheriff hesitated. "Not in danger, but in trouble. His old employer in Colorado's filed charges again, claiming he stole money and ran. They're calling him to stand trial in Denver." Lenora's heart thudded hard. "But he's innocent. You know that, Sheriff." "I do, Colin said slowly. But my word doesn't weigh much against a man with money. Thomas needs someone who can swear he's been here. Someone who can tell the court he wasn't hiding, just trying to start over. Silence filled the shop. Then Lenora said, barely above a whisper, "I'll go." The sheriff blinked. "Miss Briggs, Denver's over 200 miles from here. You've never left Silver Creek." "I've spent my whole life being afraid," she said, voice firm. "But if I can't stand for the one person who ever truly saw me, then I'll never be myself again." Colin studied her, then nodded solemnly. "You've got a brave heart, ma'am. God go with you." The next morning, Lenora closed her shop. She packed a small bundle, a worn Bible, a few coins saved over the years, and a wooden box holding an old honey jar. The one he'd said reminded me of home. When the train whistle wailed through Silver Creek, she turned to look back one last time. The rooftops were still misted with dew. Her father's store stood quiet beneath the pale sun. She felt as though she were crossing a threshold between fear and courage, between what had been and what could be. On the train, she sat by the window, the world blurred by, golden fields, rolling hills, the horizon fading into silver haze. She opened the little box, gazing at the honey gleaming inside, its soft gold catching the light. That color, warm, gentle, and sweet, reminded her of his smile. The train rumbled on, the wheels carving steady music into the rails. Lenora leaned close to the window, her voice barely a breath. "Wait for me, Thomas. I'm coming." Outside, the morning sun flared across the tracks, casting a long golden line into the distance, a thin thread of light, binding two hearts still finding their way back to each other. Denver was larger and louder than anywhere Lenora Briggs had ever known. The clatter of wagon wheels, the crack of hooves on stone, the shouts of vendors, all rose and tangled in the thin mountain air. But she heard none of it. She carried only one name through the noise: Thomas Garrett. It took her 2 days to find the courthouse where his trial was being held. When she entered, no one noticed her. Just a black woman in a plain dress, standing quietly at the back of the room. Yet something in her eyes, steady, bright, drew the air taut around her. At the front, Thomas sat flanked by 2 guards. His shirt was wrinkled, his shoulders bowed, as though the weight of years of accusation had settled there. When the door opened, he turned, and when he saw her, his breath caught. For a moment, disbelief flickered across his tired face. Lenora didn't speak. She only nodded once, a small, calm gesture that said everything. "You are not alone." Across the room, the ranch owner, Mr. Carver, was speaking sharply before the judge. "That man stole my money," he barked. "Vanished in the night with 2 months' wages and a horse. I have witnesses. I have records. A thief like him deserves no trust." Lenora stepped forward before anyone could stop her. "Your Honor," she said, her voice low but clear, "I have something to say." Heads turned. A few people snickered. The judge squinted down at her. "Your name, miss?" "Lenora Briggs. I run a general store in Silver Creek." "And what is your connection to this case?" "The man accused," she said, turning her gaze to Thomas, then back to the bench, "is someone I know. He's lived in Silver Creek for the past 6 months, working, helping others, never once hiding or running. I have his purchase records, receipts with my signature, and Sheriff Collins himself can testify to his whereabouts." The courtroom went still. The judge took the papers she offered and read them, passing them to the clerk. Mr. Carver flushed red, sputtering. You'd take her word? A colored woman's? Who knows where she came from? Lenora's voice cut through his, calm, unflinching. My skin can't lie, sir, but your conscience can. You traded yours for money long ago. A murmur rippled through the room. The judge struck his gavel for silence. He studied the documents again, then spoke. Insufficient evidence for conviction. The defendant, Thomas Garrett, is hereby released. The noise that followed was like a wave breaking. Thomas stood slowly. For a heartbeat, he didn't move. Then he crossed the room toward her. Their eyes met in the doorway, flooded with sunlight. You came all this way? He asked, his voice thick. Lenora smiled faintly, her words barely above a whisper. I couldn't let them tell the world who you are. In her voice he heard everything, faith, courage, and the quiet truth of a love that had waited too long to be spoken. He took her hand, his own shaking. Lenora, I owe you my life. She shook her head gently. No, Thomas. We both owed each other the truth. That afternoon, they walked out of the courthouse together. The wind from the Rockies carried the scent of melting snow. They moved side by side through the crowded street, but in the sea of faces, they saw only each other. At the corner, Thomas stopped. The sunset cast a bronze light over her skin, making her glow like the heart of a flame. I can't go back to Silver Creek, he said quietly. They'll never forget what was said. I won't have you suffer for it again. Lenora looked up at him, eyes unwavering. Do you believe in what's right, Thomas? Of course. Then don't let the wrong people decide where we belong. He fell silent. In her gaze, he saw a conviction stronger than any law. He understood then. She hadn't just freed him from a prison of lies, but from the fear that had ruled his life. Thomas squeezed her hand. Then we faced them together. She nodded, smiling softly. Not fragile this time, but sure like a vow. The sun dipped behind the Rockies, painting the sky in deep copper and gold. Hand in hand, they walked away from Denver, their shadows merging in the amber light. No one knew where they were headed. But from that moment on, the things once buried in shadow were free at last, and truth, about his name, about their hearts, finally stood in the open, bright and unafraid. Silver Creek greeted them not with words, but with silence. Familiar faces didn't turn away, yet no one smiled either. People stood on their porches as Thomas Garrett and Lenora Briggs walked past, eyes curious, cautious, heavy with all that had been said and could not be unsaid. Word of the Denver trial had traveled quickly. Everyone knew Thomas was innocent now, but forgiveness in a small town was slower than truth. Sheriff Collins was the first to break that silence. One morning, he stood in the middle of the square and spoke loudly enough for every ear to hear. Thomas Garrett is no thief, no liar. I know the man. I trust him. And I hope Silver Creek will give these two the one thing they've earned: fairness. No one replied, but the air shifted. The next day, when Lenora reopened her shop, a few old customers returned, buying flour, sugar, thread. No one spoke of the past. They simply nodded, paid, and left. But to her, that quiet acceptance felt like sunlight. After a long winter, the little store that had weathered so much opened its doors again, this time under a new name: Briggs and Garrett General Store. Thomas stood beside her as they hung the new sign. Together they held the rope, pulling the wooden board into place. The hammer struck steady, each blow like a heartbeat. Lenora looked up, the letters swinging softly in the breeze. Looks better than I imagined, she murmured. Thomas smiled. I only held the nails. The beauty's in your name. Her lips curved faintly. In our names. They both laughed. The first time she'd laughed freely since their return. Days folded gently into routine. He lifted crates and stacked barrels. She arranged shelves and tied paper parcels. At noon, they shared bread and weak coffee behind the shop. Words were few, but glances were enough. Thomas still rose early to sweep the porch before sunrise. Each afternoon, Lenora brewed tea and brought him a cup. No sugar, just a drop of honey. He'd smile every time and say softly, "Reminds me of home." One afternoon, Josephine Edwards walked in. The scent of her perfume filled the air, and conversation in the store stopped. Thomas was unloading supplies. Lenora stood behind the counter. "Miss Briggs," Josephine began, her tone hesitant, "I came for some thread, and to say I heard about Denver. Congratulations, to both of you." Lenora nodded politely. "Thank you." Josephine placed her money on the counter, glancing at Thomas. "Seems you finally found the right place to settle." He met her gaze evenly. "I think I have." Josephine's lips curved, not cruelly this time, but almost kindly. "Good. It suits you." Then she left, and for the first time, the silence she left behind didn't sting. It felt peaceful. Spring returned, gentle and full. The fields around Silver Creek bloomed again after months of frost. Their store became more than a business. It became a place of trust. Children ran in to buy candy, and Lenora always slipped in an extra piece for your little sister at home. Thomas helped the elders carry grain, sometimes mending their fences after closing hours. Slowly, quietly, Silver Creek began to change, and so did they. One golden evening, Lenora climbed a small ladder to hang a new sign by the porch, "Open till sunset." Thomas stood below, holding the ladder steady. "When I first came here," he said, his voice low, "I thought I'd stay a few weeks. Maybe a month, then..." She looked down, smiling. "Then what?" "Then someone made me forget I ever meant to leave." Lenora brushed a loose strand of hair from her face. "Funny. I never thought I'd find someone to help me rebuild this place either." Thomas tilted his head, that quiet smile lighting his eyes. "Yet here we are." The last rays of sun spilled through the window, turning the wood sign gold. She finished her work and stepped down, and he caught her lightly by the waist to steady her. Together, they looked up at the board. Briggs and Garrett General Store, gleaming in the amber light. The wind carried the scent of fresh-cut pine and a faint trace of honey. Thomas whispered, "Looks like a beginning." Lenora's hand rested in his. "No," she said softly. "Looks like a home." And as the sun slipped behind the hills, they stayed on the porch, shoulder to shoulder. Two souls once cast aside by the world, now standing beneath the roof they'd built together, with love strong enough that no storm could ever tear it down again. That autumn, Silver Creek wore gold like a quiet blessing. Birch leaves blanketed the main street. The sound of harmonicas drifted from the saloon, and the smell of baked apples floated through the town hall, where the annual harvest festival was underway. Lenora stood on the porch of the store, watching people hang ribbons and lanterns, children darting about in their little boots and bright dresses. Every year before, she'd closed early on this night, preferring silence to stares. But this year was different. Inside, Thomas was fastening the last crate, then turned toward her with a knowing smile. "You'll go this time?" he asked, already guessing the answer. Lenora glanced down at her work-rough hands. I've never gone before. Then tonight's a good place to start, he said, his voice low and warm. You can't keep that door closed forever and let the world dance without you. By nightfall, the hall blazed with lamplight. People filled the room, laughter rising with the music. In one corner, Josephine Edwards, dressed in crimson, laughed a little too loudly, her eyes flicking toward the door again and again. When Thomas walked in beside Lenora, the chatter dimmed, replaced by whispers that rustled through the crowd like wind. Lenora wore a soft brown dress and a pair of old gloves. The lamplight caught her skin and turned it to warm bronze. Thomas, in a clean white shirt and brown vest, guided her through the crowd, calm, unhurried, as though the noise around them belonged to someone else. Josephine stepped forward, her smile too sweet. Mr. Garrett, she said lightly, you finally came. I was beginning to think you'd bring someone unexpected. Thomas met her gaze steady. I did, he said simply. The right one. His eyes turned to Lenora. For a heartbeat, Josephine faltered. She forced a brittle smile. Then I wish you both a pleasant evening. As she turned away, Lenora whispered, You didn't have to. Thomas cut in softly. I only said the truth. The band shifted into a slow waltz. The violin's melody floated through the warm air, soft as breath. Thomas faced her, extending a hand. Will you dance with me, Miss Briggs? She hesitated, glancing at the curious eyes around them. Then she slipped her hand into his. Are you sure? Never been surer, he said. They stepped onto the wooden floor, moving gently to the music. Each turn seemed to slow time itself. The whispers faded, replaced by the hush of something fragile and beautiful taking shape. People stopped talking, watching instead. A woman once deemed out of place and a man who had wandered all his life with nowhere to belong. When the final note faded, no one clapped. There was only silence. The kind that comes when a truth too tender has just been spoken without words. Thomas kept her hand in his, eyes never leaving hers. The first week I came to Silver Creek, he said, quietly. I thought I'd leave before the month was out. I didn't think peace was something I'd ever find here. Lenora's smile was soft. And then? Then I met you, he said, and peace stopped being a place. It became a person. She drew in a breath, but he went on, voice trembling just enough to betray him. You're the only peace I ever found. The room seemed to dissolve around them, the lights, the murmurs, all fading until only his voice remained. Lenora didn't cry. She only smiled, steady and full. The smile of someone who'd waited her whole life to believe that love could find her, not as charity, but as truth. Thomas Garrett, she whispered, if you call this peace, then I'll be its home. He laughed softly, the sound small but full of gratitude. Around them, the music began again. The crowd stirred, life resumed. But they stood still, hands entwined, as if the rest of the world were only backdrop. Across the room, Josephine watched in silence, not with bitterness this time, but understanding. Some things, she realized, can't be forced or earned. Love, real love, belongs to those who've lost enough to recognize it when it finally arrives. Later, when the hall had emptied and the lanterns burned low, Thomas took Lenora's hand and led her outside. The night air carried the scent of apples and wood smoke. Under the soft glow of the harvest moon, he stopped and turned to her. We've spent years missing out on living, he said, his voice rough with feeling. But maybe now, it's not too late to begin. Lenora nodded. If it's with you, then every beginning is enough. She leaned her head against his shoulder. The dance was over, but its rhythm lingered, a quiet melody that would carry them through every season yet to come. Years passed. Silver Creek was no longer the small, rigid town it used to be. The main road was newly paved, shop signs gleamed in the morning light, and the place once known for gossip had become a place for living. At the center of that street still hung a weathered wooden sign, Briggs and Garrett General Store. Its paint had faded, but the carved letters remained clear, simple and steadfast, much like the two souls who had built it. Each morning, sunlight filtered through the windows, brushing across neatly lined shelves. The small bell chimed as customers came and went. Lenora stepped out from behind the counter, her apron dusted with flour, her smile gentle, the same smile Thomas had fallen for all those years ago on a quiet porch morning. She was no longer the woman whispered about behind closed doors, but someone respected, greeted with genuine warmth. "Morning, Mrs. Garrett," people would say as they entered. And this time, they meant it. Thomas now managed the freight warehouse for the new rail line that ran through Silver Creek. On weekends, he still helped her in the shop, fixing shelves, counting stock, or sometimes just finding an excuse to stay near her. The hair at his temples had silvered, but his smile hadn't changed, only softened, slower now, and reserved for one person alone. They had 2 children, Jonah, 8, quick-footed and full of mischief, forever climbing onto freight wagons when his father wasn't looking, and Lila, 6, bright-eyed and gentle, always at her mother's side in the back garden picking flowers. That patch of earth was Lenora's joy, a small square of land where, against all odds, flowers bloomed in once barren soil. Under her care, color and life returned, proof that with enough patience and faith, even the hardest ground could grow soft again. Every evening, when Thomas came home, he paused at the doorway, setting down his hat, taking in the sight before him. Lila scattering feed for the birds, Jonah chasing their small dog around the yard, and Lenora bent over her lavender bed. The peace of it caught in his throat each time, too vast for words. He walked over and laid a hand on her shoulder. "Soil's wet today," he murmured. She smiled without looking up. "That's how the flowers like it." "Just like you," he said quietly. "You always bloom after the rain." She glanced up, her laughter catching the last of the evening sun. And in that light, Thomas saw it again, the quiet miracle of the life they'd built, piece by piece, without fanfare, but with unwavering grace. When dusk settled over the valley, the family gathered on the porch. Thomas sat on the wooden chair, reading the Silver Creek Gazette, whose front page praised the new rail line and the prosperity it brought. Lenora poured tea, the scent of mint floating between them, her hands moving with the ease of habit. "Pa," Jonah said suddenly, "when I grow up, I want to work at the warehouse like you." Thomas folded the paper, smiling. "You can be whatever you want, son. Just don't ever let anyone else tell you who you are." Lenora looked at him then. That look they shared when words weren't needed. She poured 2 cups of tea, setting one beside him and keeping the other for herself. They sat quietly for a while, listening to the wind. The years had taken much, fear, judgment, and the weight of old wounds, but left them with what mattered most: kindness, faith, and a love that didn't need to shout to be heard. Lila sat on the step below, stringing flowers into a small crown. "Mama," she asked, "what's this one called?" Lavender, Lenora said. It smells like peace. Thomas added softly, like your mama. Lenora shook her head, smiling. You still say things that make it hard to stay mad at you. Good, he replied, grinning. Because I don't plan to stop. Night fell gently. Lamps flickered on, their glow mingling with children's laughter and the rustle of paper as Thomas folded his newspaper. Life moved forward. Not grandly, not perfectly, but with the quiet rhythm of people who had learned to forgive the world and themselves. Lenora stood and looked around the house. Every beam, every nail, every brush of paint, a reminder that two people once left with nothing had built something that would last. Thomas lowered the paper and glanced outside. Moonlight spilled across the porch, soft and silver, touching his face. The same smile that once turned heads in Silver Creek appeared, though now it carried something deeper. He used to be known for his smile, but now that smile belonged to her and to the quiet home they built from courage and forgiveness. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts about the home they built. Leave a comment, a like, and subscribe so we can keep remembering, together, that love, no matter how late it arrives, can still be true to the very end.